Hi, I'm Alison McCall, and today my colleague Lesley Dunbar and I, both members of Aberdeen Women's Alliance, will be talking to you about the history of witchcraft in Aberdeen for Aberdeen's WayWORD Festival. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Our witch walk begins today here on the Heading Hill, close to the site of the burnings, a dark episode in Aberdeen's history. Imagine the smoke and the smell. In 1596-7, there were 31 cases of witchcraft in Aberdeen, 3 men and 28 women. We know 27 women and 2 men were executed, strangled, then burned. Burned so no remains of them were available to create further acts of harm. We need to understand then that people believed in witchcraft, and they believed that evil acts could happen with a spell or a curse or another enchantment. One family are to play a prominent part in this story. Janet Wishart and her son Thomas Lays, her husband John Wishart and her daughters Elspeth, Janet and Violet. Public executions are a great spectacle in the town. People come from far and near. In 1597, when Margaret Bain was being burnt and strangled here on the Heading Hill, the press of the crowd was so strong that 2 of the spars were broken. We still have the record of the cost of replacing them in the townhouse, in the charter room. The Dean of Guild accounts in the town show an itemised account of the execution of the witches in 1597. John Justice, the public executioner or hangman, is paid 6 shillings and 8 pence. That's about 40 pence in today's money. This is the equivalent then of 2 days of a labourer's wage. He was also paid 13 shillings and 4 pence per execution. There are costs for the tar barrels, the iron barrels, the stake and the carrying of it and setting it up, and costs also for the rope that was used to drag the witch or witches through the streets and tie them to a stake inside a barrel. UNESCO have recognised the borough records of Aberdeen as being the most complete in Scotland, starting from 1398 to the present. They are inscribed as part of the World Memory Project.
Yep. This is Aberdeen's Market Cross. It's carved with the faces of Scotland's monarchs, and in particular this monarch, James VI of Scotland, and later the 1st of England. It was James who instigated the great witch hunts in Scotland. Now, a belief in witchcraft had been widespread throughout medieval Scotland, but it was not until the Witchcraft Act of 1563 that witchcraft became a capital offence. James married Anne of Denmark in 1589, and her first attempt to come to Scotland was thwarted by storms which pushed her boat back. So James then set off from Scotland to collect his bride, but again the journey was affected by storms. There had been a belief in witchcraft in Germany which had spread into Denmark. There was a lot of talk in Denmark that these storms were the result of witchcraft, and in fact 2 women in Denmark were executed. Once back in Scotland, James was determined to investigate. After all, he thought that this had threatened his life and that of his wife, and he wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on. This is what started the North Berwick witch trials. Witches were arrested, tortured, and named other people as prospective witches, who in turn were tortured, and so it went on. Until eventually, over 100 people, most but not all women, had been accused of witchcraft, and many of those had been executed. And then from North Berwick, the witch trials spread throughout Scotland, and they reached Aberdeen in 1596, 1597. The accusations against the witches were a mixture of long-standing complaints and quite fantastic stories which had been obtained through sleep deprivation and similar torture. One of the latter stories was that of the witches' dance in the Halloween 1595, which was alleged to have taken place here between the Market Cross and the Fish Cross in Aberdeen. Now, in this dance, allegedly, the devil had played music for the witches to dance to, and they'd been joined with cats and hares for this sort of fantastic scene. Several of the witches who are supposed to have taken part in this dance were named, including Thomas Leys, who was the son of Janet Wishart, and also Isabel Cockey of Kintore. Now, this witches' dance wasn't the only accusation against Isabel Cockey. It's obvious from a whole long list of accusations against her that she was a woman who had quarrelled with and cursed her neighbours frequently, and that she had a short temper. And there was also evidence that she had made some money by making healing charms out of coloured wools and selling them in Kintore. But the image of this witches' dance really caught the imagination at the time and sort of cemented the belief that witchcraft was happening here in Aberdeen's Castlegate. We know many of the accusations against the witches because, as Lesley had said, many of the records survive. One of the records that has survived very well is the dittes or accusations against Janet Wishart. Janet Wishart was married to John Leys. They had 4 children, 3 daughters, Elspeth, Janet and Violet, and a son, Thomas Leys. We've already heard about Thomas in connection with the alleged Halloween witches' dance. The family originally lived in School Hill, but at the time of the witch trials, they were living round about here in the Justice Port. Now, the first accusation against Janet went back for 24 years. She'd had a long reputation by the time of the witch trials. 5 young men, 3 of them students, had been returning home at 2 in the morning, and they had spotted Janet leaving her neighbour Adam Mayer's yard, and they believed that she had been up to no good. So they accosted her, and then they roused the Mayer household. Janet was furious. She cursed the 5 young men, and the next day 2 of the men drowned while bathing off the links in Aberdeen. And so from this point on, people had made a connection between Janet losing her temper and bad things happening. Other dittes against Janet included one by the wife of Alexander Rate. She and 2 other women had gone to Janet to purchase some malt, but Janet didn't have any available to sell. However, she said that she would winnow some. The 3 women were going to leave, assuming that this would take some time, but Janet apparently conjured up a wind and was able to winnow the malt immediately. And again, this is a case where the 3 women obviously knew that Janet had a reputation and were suspicious of anything that she did. Walter Mealing was a shopkeeper in the Castlegate, and he had refused to sell wool to Janet. She cursed him, and sometime later his young daughter died. John Pyatt was a stabler and a neighbour of Janet's in the Justice Port, and he also had quarrelled with Janet and subsequently taken ill and died. There does seem to be a pattern here, but it has to be remembered that this was a time of plague and pestilence, and sudden illness and death was not uncommon. Another accusation against Janet was made by her son-in-law. Janet had quarrelled with him, believing that he had hit her daughter, and her son-in-law believed that if he were to hit her daughter again, he would be attacked by a supernatural black dog. Now, this is quite understandable that she would have threatened her son-in-law if she discovered that he had been violent towards her daughter. So all these stories had built up around Janet, and many of the witnesses who gave evidence did so in good faith, genuinely believing that what they have witnessed was witchcraft.
So we're here at the toll booth, and round the corner, on the corner of Broad Street and Union Street, we can see the whipping stone. John Justice was appointed as hangman on the 18th of February 1596. His duties included executions, banishments, scourging or whipping, burning and tormenting. Tormenting is essentially torture, and we know that witches that were held were often kept awake and walked up and down until they made their confessions. A witch could be held here at the ward house, awaiting trial and following their trial, sentencing and awaiting execution. Medieval burgesses bankrolled the monarch and were granted the privilege of enforcing his writ in the royal borough by force of arms. The burgesses are the police, the army, the lawmakers and local government all rolled into one. The burgesses had applied to the King's Privy Council to set up a commission to have witch trials, and sizable costs were incurred to ensure strict judicial guidelines and legal procedure was carried out before a witch was executed. These costs were met by the burgesses, but a witch's property could be confiscated or pinioned. Some common forms of punishment for women were the scold's bridle, one of which we still have in the toll booth here today. The other was burning the cheek, where a hot brand was applied to the cheek.
The last person to be executed for witchcraft in Aberdeen was Marion Hardy, who was executed in 1630. She had confessed to devilish cantrips and throwing stones in the River Dee, which had resulted in the sinking of Richard Cadenhead's boat with all hands on board. 6 years later, in 1636, Margaret Fraser was imprisoned in the toll booth for witchcraft, but she managed to escape. Here in Correction Wynd, there's a plaque marking the site of the House of Correction, which was founded by Provost Jaffrey Sr. in 1637. The Jaffreys were caught up in the religious turmoil of the time, eventually becoming Quakers, and Provost Jaffrey Jr. was imprisoned for his Quaker beliefs in 1668. Now, one member of the Jaffrey family, Grizzle Jaffrey, we don't know the exact relationship with Provost Jaffrey, moved to Dundee, where she married one of the burgesses of Dundee, so she married into another influential family there. In 1669, the year after Provost Jaffrey Jr. was imprisoned, Grizzle Jaffrey was accused of witchcraft in Dundee, and a lot of the problem appears to have been that she was probably also a Quaker, we don't know for sure, but she seemed to have been living out with the dominant Presbyterian culture of the time, and the three men who brought her to trial were all Presbyterian ministers. Grizzle Jaffrey was found guilty and executed. She's the last person to be executed for witchcraft in Dundee, and today a plaque and a pavement mosaic mark the spot of her execution. The story of the Aberdeen witches inspired this piece of art in St Nicholas Lane by Carrie Reinhardt, who put it here as part of the New Art Festival. Owing to the number of witches awaiting trial over the winter of 1596, they ran out of room in the ward house, and witches were imprisoned here in the 15th century St Mary's Chapel. John Gordon or Williamson was the first witch to be held here, who was accused of being manifest an open witch. In September 1596, 4 types of evidence were used at witches' trials. Firstly, there was the confession of the witch themselves. Secondly, there was evidence from friends or neighbours or even relatives. Thirdly, there was the testimony of other witches, and bearing in mind this might be given by somebody who might be trying to get themselves out of trouble. And fourthly, there was the witch's mark. If a mark was found on a witch's body which might identify them as a witch, that would prove that they had had a pact with the devil. One example of a witch's mark might be an extra nipple, and another might be a patch of skin where if the person was pricked with a needle, they didn't flinch, they felt no pain. And the areas where no pain was felt were indicative that the person was a witch. Surviving borough records tell us that a local blacksmith was paid to make a ring, which still exists, to shackle the witches to in St Mary's Chapel. There were 5 stages in the judicial process to trying a witch. The first was identifying someone who was believed to be a witch. The second was interviewing friends or relatives and gathering information from potential witnesses. And this was done either by the church or by the burgesses of the city. The third was submitting this evidence to the Privy Council and King in Edinburgh, and if they felt there was enough evidence, they would grant permission to have a commission. The fourth was for the commission to try the witch, and then fifthly, if found guilty, the witch would be executed. Aberdeen had an estimated population of about 5,000 in the 16th century, although this would be swelled by crowds coming in for market. But still, it was a relatively small population. Everybody would know everybody else. And if somebody gained a reputation for witchcraft, it would soon become common currency within a fairly tight-knit community. Now, Aberdeen obviously was much smaller in the 15th century, and today we've actually walked across medieval Aberdeen from the Heading Hill, past the Market Cross, past the Tolbooth. Now here we are at the Mither Kirk, St Nicholas Kirk. So this is kind of the area. And within this area, everybody who lived within this would have actually known somebody that there was a rumour about, or would have been related to somebody, or they might have approached somebody for a healing charm, or they might have felt that they or their neighbours or their family or somebody they knew had been affected by witchcraft. This wasn't a niche thing in Aberdeen at the time. In a relatively small population, the number of women and men who were accused of witchcraft meant that at the time everybody would have known one of these women. They would have been a friend or a relative or known to them in some way. So in 1596 and 97, we could say that Aberdeen society was saturated by the witchcraft hunt. Lesley and I hope that today's walk has given you some insight into witchcraft in Aberdeen. So thank you very much for listening to this today. Thank you.